This is about higher consciousness. Higher consciousness doesn't have a name, and it isn't reached through a technique. I've re-edited the text for this video too many times now, and it never gets shorter. It never feels like it's totally right. It never feels like it's finished. Metaphysics tends to get very wordy because words aren't really an adequate way to express intuition. And metaphysics and healing is all about feeling and intuition. Well, this is the long, continuous version on this subject, and I'm going to make a series of shorter videos as well that break down the subject into shorter segments and then test to find out which methods get the most views and comments. And I'll be using this approach with each new subject until I figure out what works best. I'm not going to call the mental healing process that I recommend and practice by any name. There are a lot of names for healing techniques circulating around in the community of thinkers who practice hands-off spiritual mental healing. I think healing is not really a technique. I'd simply call what I would encourage practicing scientific mental healing. And there also will be a certain group who object to the word scientific. And that's because the general accepted definition of scientific implies the necessity for materially measured proof. Well, my own definition of scientific refers simply to the manifestation of observable results as a result of affecting something, causing something. And in that sense, even conventional materialistic medical healing isn't scientific either, because there's not really anything solid and measurable that connects the application of a physical healing that's brought about by materialistic treatment with the observed results. Nothing more solid than a firm conviction that the effect resulted from what the doctor or the healing practitioner claimed was the cause. And I'm going to apply the same principle here. The result of spiritual healing is also verifiable only by the presence of observed results. Results which we can only assume came to fruition as an apparent consequence of the application of a certain state of conscious thought, the same as which occurs in materialistic medical healing. So in that sense, I interpret spiritual methods to be at least as scientific in the conventional sense of that word as is material medical practice. At the heart of the experience of scientific spiritual mental healing is the ability to differentiate between the relative reality of the materialistic human world and the more transcendental and absolute spiritual level of reality, which mortally based human consciousness has a little bit of trouble identifying. seeing this differentiation involves a lot more than using the logical left half of your brain. It's intuitive, and sometimes it's also shockingly transcendental to the point of feeling not acceptable. There is a variety of material available online, both written and recorded. It's been created by a number of successful spiritual healers with forwardly progressive new ideas. And all of them present the topic of the effectiveness, reliability, and consistency of mental healing. And every one of these spiritual healers addresses, in their own way, how to go about making spiritual healing a possible part of your own experience. I share a lot of perspectives with all of them. And my purpose in this video is to point out where my thought patterns differ from a sort of norm that seems to have developed in the metaphysical community. A norm that's developed without intention, of course. And it's a norm in current metaphysical thinking that's identifiable as a continuing tendency to approach spiritual healing unwittingly, still from the perspective of materiality, as opposed to thinking and healing from a perspective of pure, unadulterated, conscious spirituality. The ideas I have to suggest may feel somewhat spiritually radical, even for many new thinkers' perspectives, and that's probably because it just feels transcendental at first glance. It's a lot to swallow. It doesn't feel like a way of thought that fits in with everyday thought. And indeed, it doesn't fit with everyday thought. And that's because everyday thought is physical. And we're talking here about metaphysics. The out-of-the-box spiritual ideas that I'm going to discuss here are the meat of my personal position in the metaphysical field. I want to discuss some of these out-of-the-box spiritual ideas with you here in this video, because I believe that if the world is really to advance, then we as individuals and we as so-called or claiming to be practitioners of the healing art, we have to enable ourselves to continually further push open the door that leads to the threshold of a higher consciousness. But we're still so bound to our earthly world. We're so bound to this earthly world that our door is just barely cracked open. So our objective here with this video is to open it up a little bit more and keep pushing it open. So let's see what we can do to do that. All mental healing philosophies are similar, and they're highly effective. There are slight variations from one individual philosophy to another, and there are people who meet with more success than others for various reasons. Those reasons not necessarily being a problem with the philosophy, Often it's just a problem with the practitioner being able to identify with how to go about carrying these things through to fruition. But the fact, I believe, is that each and every healing, although it appears to be physical, is actually purely mental. And regardless of whether or not any kind of ritual is part of the process of healing, and whether that's a routine or a prayer or the use of material medicine, no matter what that ritual might be, at the root of every healing is a mental transformation. Whether we consciously realize that or not, that's what healing is. A ritual isn't necessary, but a change in conscious activity and content is, in order to bring about what we would call the manifestation of healing. We all seem to have trouble grasping what's actually behind the healing phenomenon. And that's primarily because the human mind is so conditioned to witnessing material manifestation. It's so conditioned to believing that doing something has to mean manipulating or transforming matter, changing matter from one state to another. On the other hand, we are willing to admit that man is essentially and fundamentally a spiritual being. What we need is to enable ourselves to break out of the box of seeing ourselves as both material beings and spiritual beings. And because this point is seldom recognized, healing is too often approached from the perspective that material conditions are the meat, the substance of what constitutes our health. I hope that sentence about not being both spiritual and material caught your attention. I maintain that man is not, in the absolute sense anyway, both material and spiritual. Man has to be one or the other, but in the absolute sense is never both. For that sometimes shocking proposition to make any sense at all, we have to first be able to understand and realize that the human perspective is more focused on materiality than it is on spirit. It's just a matter of conditioning. And so conditioned human thought objects to a proposition like this that seems contrary to common sense. Human thought knows for a fact that to its sense, experiences feel both material and spiritual. But does that make it actually so? A human life is a product of a person's own mentally created manifestation of what that person mentally believes himself to be, of what his convictions about himself are. Human beings see themselves as a combination of a spiritual nature and a material nature. But matter is a product of the human mind. a human perspective of how being can be manifest. And it's only actually a perspective. So consider for a minute this proposition. The proposition is, the human mind is a mental realm in which materiality and spirituality are both accepted as realities, but that this does not make them both realities. That is, when viewed from the absolute God consciousness perspective, the source perspective. Neither is the human mind perspective as high as consciousness can go and should go. We're all learning that we can go higher than we are now. What the human mind creates is a relative reality. And the humans who populate this world consist and live in a consciousness that shares the general conviction that matter is the foundation of reality. And hence, humans, interpreted as man, tend to be inhibited by material law. But let's consider that we could stop thinking and feeling from the human perspective. Let's not limit ourselves by believing the same limitations that the collective beliefs of the world and our human mind, which participates in that belief actively, have decided for us. Instead, let's make a decision to get out of this world box. Let's work on expanding our own consciousness to reach perceptions of the absolute divine perspective. What do I mean by the divine perspective? That's the mental realm where ideas carry more clout than their manifestation does. Although human experience comes to us now as a reality, both matter and spirit can never be simultaneously true. And again, I mean in the absolute sense of the highest form of consciousness of what constitutes being. And I'll call that God consciousness, source consciousness. That's the root of our consciousness. We each reflect the consciousness of all that is. And that which is, in the absolute sense, must remain harmonious eternally. Otherwise, if it weren't harmonious, it would eventually become is not, and so it would vanish. And in the human world, then that which does become is not, and which vanishes, which we previously had interpreted as is, we can conclude that we can and must interpret these things as mental deceptions, not as solid facts as they present themselves and as the world's belief system has convinced us all that they are. That which is not will vanish in the perception, in the presence of clearly perceived absolute consciousness. So to give this a little more clarity, let's look at some examples of how we can apply this concept and make the world a better place by putting a mental stop to the terrible, convincing deceptions that take place in the relative reality of human life that we all insist is reality. In this higher sense, light is, and darkness is not. Light is based on principle. Darkness is simply the absence of light and has no principle of its own. Health is. Disease is not. And health is based in principle. Health is a natural condition, a principled condition. Disease and sickness have no principle of their own. Harmony is. Chaos is not. Accident is not. Harmony and order is based in principle. Chaos and accident are the apparent lack of harmony, and they have no principle of their own. Perfection is. Deformity is not. Breakage is not. Peace is. Conflict is not. War is not. And you can go on listing principled, harmonious, eternal things and their equivalent opposites at the other end of the pole, which claim to have reality, which do not. The most easy to understand one is about light, because you can turn on a light switch because light has principle. So when you turn the light off, you're not turning darkness on, you're turning light off, because darkness has no principle. And that same concept applies to everything which has no principle of its own, but is just the negative polarity of that which is principled. It's a copy. Clearly perceived consciousness transcends the material senses. And material senses are just what their name says they are. Material senses are only sensors that detect the presence of manifest material form. But these senses obviously are not able to detect the idea behind those forms. What brought the forms about, what brought them into manifestation. The senses cannot detect that. The senses can only see the form. Material presentation is a lot like the movie we watch on the movie screen. We really get into the movie, and we might tend to even make it into a temporary reality, have emotional reactions to it, get pulled into the story. But when we trace the light rays from the screen back to the wall behind us, we see that the scenes in the movie aren't reality. They're pictures being projected from another source called a projector. And the projector has nothing to do with the contents of the movie it's showing. The projector can be shut down. Other movies can be played in place of the one that was there. Your own human mind is a projector of your relative human reality. But that reality plays independently of the world of the spiritual and absolute. When the movie's over, you can walk out of the theater and can realize that the movie wasn't reality. Likewise, we have a sort of hidden ability to walk out of the presence of the human projection of life. Walk out on it and see spiritual reality. See the world outside the theater. But in order to do this, in order to see the originating form, our natural sense of consciousness, our base, our root, our God consciousness, if you will, our source consciousness, in order to see this, intuition is needed. Intuition does not come to us through the material senses. We have to learn to be able to decide if we don't like the film that's playing, and either change the movie or walk out of the theater. The manifestation of spirit and the manifestation of matter are different in nature. And the difference between them might be likened to the difference between the seeming reality of the movie and the solid but spiritual reality that's going on outside the theater. I shouldn't say spiritual reality in the example, but in a comparative sense, I'm talking about the spiritual reality that's going on outside of our human mind. So where should our attention be focused? On the matter? On the movie? Or on the world outside? On the spiritual world? And that's the part that's transcendental to human sense. That which has really substantial substance is spiritual. We just do not experience it in our everyday, humanly sensed, materially sensed environment. It comes to us through intuition. Spirit is, and spirit is eternal. It could be likened to the outside world. Matter, like the movie, is always a temporary appearance. Always. Matter is always a temporary appearance. Try to think of an example when it isn't. Spirit is the real essence of being. And matter must be only one form of a possible appearance, possible manifestation of things that can be seen through a sort of combination of intuition and material sense. Remember that the movie can always be changed to another movie. Matter presents form to consciousness as a temporary picture. But things in their root form are actually defined in the absolute sense by thought alone. Who made the movie? Now that may be a confusing set of points there, but go back and think something more basic. Thoughts do not require matter to exist. In fact, thoughts are the source of the appearance of material things in our experience. Thoughts are the source of the condition of what becomes manifest in our experience. Thoughts are responsible for the appearance and consciousness of what we call things. And the quality of those things depends on the quality of the thought that creates them. Think about it. Everything is defined by the thought of that thing. Take away the thought of a thing, and there is no thing. You can look at a tree and know that it's a tree. If you don't know that it's a tree, there's no tree. You're looking at the thought of a tree, not a tree. I believe the real and eternal substance of things to be in their own source idea, not in their presentation. And that means that the real substance is spiritual, never material, and can only come to us through intuition. And intuition doesn't come to us through the material senses. The matter that we see is only a cloak that serves to present a thought as something that's tangible to our human senses. And our human senses can't sense anything beyond matter. They're matter-based. So it's intuition that we need in order to be able to learn to begin to sense a higher state of being, a higher sense of consciousness. This leads to the idea that our materiality, as well as the materiality of our environment and that of our fellow beings, is no more than the manifest product of a sort of collective conscious interpretation of which all of humankind is convinced and believes firmly in. This sort of collective human consciousness creates what appears to be our collective common human reality. But that isn't fixed. That's changeable because there are infinite possibilities, and we won't see all those possibilities until we learn to consciously look at them and focus on them intuitively. Consciousness creates reality. Let's start there, but also replace the concept of separated human minds in a plural sense with the concept of a holographic style concept of one God consciousness, one source consciousness, which manifests itself naturally as what we might call generic man. That's the spiritual man. Each individualized spiritual being an element of an infinite holographic style representation in which each and every individual reflects the full creative power of its source, just like in the hologram. A source we could call God, if we so choose. Let's set our conscious mind to realize and know that we are and we must be this source consciousness itself, God consciousness, by virtue of the definition of consciousness. Consciousness is awareness, and awareness must be awareness of that which is. And that which is has its source. We're going to call its source the source, or God. Source consciousness is aware only of the constructive and necessarily harmonious, of that which constructively is in its eternal sense. A point I already touched on, but we'll come back to that again. This is the part of the most spiritual approach to mental healing that feels so transcendental to the human mind. But it's vital and essential. The point being that God consciousness, source consciousness, our actual root consciousness, is aware only of the constructive and necessarily harmonious, of that which constructively is in its eternal sense, never destructively. And I believe this to be a philosophical point that's still too often glossed over. And the reason it gets missed is because the human mind thinks always and continually in terms of matter and material manifestation. And so it tends, even among sometimes advanced spiritual thinkers, it tends to tuck away for safekeeping the concept of our totally spiritual nature. And then it wants to pull the concept of our totally spiritual nature out of safekeeping and use it as a sort of instant cure whenever an issue comes up in life that needs to be addressed. Sort of like taking a mental pill. But instead of tucking and hiding away our spiritual nature and then pulling it out as a ready cure for human problems when they come up, wouldn't it be preferable instead to just avoid the phenomenon of human problems taking manifest form in the first place, and to learn to be enabled by the conscious, active, conscious realization of our always present spiritual nature? All of this can take place even in the seeming presence of sometimes negative experiences, negative material experiences that present themselves in human life, experiences that feel like they comprise our human life. But we can mentally rise above these presentations by seeing the thought that underlies them. With this in mind, in addressing, for example, the claim of sickness, we'll meet with the quickest success in healing when we keep foremost in mind the absolute position, the God consciousness position, the one source consciousness position, the position that there is no disease, in the same sense that there is no light. That is, one more time, there is no disease in terms of the one absolute state of principled consciousness. that underlies our human consciousness, an absolute state of consciousness which is the pure reflection of eternal, harmonious isness. I mean that there is no disease from the God consciousness perspective, from the perspective of the one consciousness in which each and every one of us is actually right now living at every moment. In spite of the earthly negative pictures that we feel like we experience as humans, like the movie and the theater, and a distorted human version of consciousness. And underneath that mask of human mortality, we are actually eternal, individualized, holographic representatives of the infinite power of universal God creation, source creation. We each have the infinite source within us, just as every piece of the hologram represents its original in its entirety. But once again, excuse me, once again from the mortal-based human consciousness perspective, we are still apparently dealing with correcting and eliminating disease as a relative reality. Don't get me wrong there. Not being unrealistic. But realizing that we don't have to accept every presentation shown to us in that projection. Just as we're free to walk out on a movie we don't like. That realization can and will immediately unlock self-imposed mental shackles. All spiritual healers rightly approach correcting undesirable situations through a mental process that involves changing thought patterns and erasing undesirable false convictions. And these are thought patterns that are responsible for the undesirable manifestations that they produce. Healing will become faster and more effective, sometimes even instantaneously realized, in proportion as we learn to accept this sense of holographic God consciousness, a source consciousness perspective, a purely intuitive conscious state that has nothing to do with material sensation. And that in place of the human consciousness perspective, which feels so familiar and comfortable to us, this perspective can become our new assumed identity. The result of an automatic retraining of the subconscious process that we've learned through our habitual earthly education. Right now, each of us, to some extent, believe and are convinced that we are human beings living in a mortal world in which everything has a beginning and an ending. But deep underneath this facade of mortal human appearance, we all are, in a spiritual sense, here and now, powerful spiritual beings in our real essence. There is a real world going on outside the movie theater. As a consequence of this human tendency to think in a habitual and limited fashion, even the most advanced quantum theory-based spiritual healing still tends to continue to reflect a mental approach that's coming from the assumption that we should aim to change material conditions. And indeed, when we heal, we do end up changing material conditions in the end. And healing does actually take place as consciousness affects the energy in the matrix that surrounds us. But seeing as we are spiritual beings in nature, and we admit and know this, should the change in matter form, be our end objective? Think about that. Although material changes do take place as a result of mental transformations in the process of spiritual healing, we're most benefited and we're most elevated in consciousness when we keep constantly in mind that we're not really material beings, and that our actual goal is the elevation of our consciousness, bringing ourselves mentally closer to the realization of the absolute, seeing beyond the shadow form representation that matter is. And that seeing is the real substance of healing. We can learn the benefits of knowing that we are not bound to the mortally human frame of reference. And once again, at the risk of repeating myself, this is a difficult transcendental point that human thinking has trouble embracing. It's hard for the human mind to embrace because dropping a sense of mortality transcends the entire human nature. The entire human nature is really an unnecessary conviction of the necessity of the apparent cycle of birth, maturity, and decay, followed by death, repeating itself over and over again. And this human nature likes itself. It likes its mortal repeating presentation. It loves matter. And so it's not at all willing to give itself up. However, as we advance in our individual ability to maintain and grow a more constant spiritual perspective, we can find step by step, we can grow out of these apparent human stages of consciousness, and we can arise, and we can advance step by step into a more spiritual stage of the demonstration of being. And each demonstration that we make of our dominion over sickness, accident, any adverse condition, no matter how small that demonstration is, each demonstration is another tiny step in the transformation of consciousness into the realization that there is no decay of naturally harmonious condition, which is eternal in a timeless sense. And once again, yes, in the human perspective, there is decay. Our objective is to arise above the human perspective, and in that process, to create an improved, more highly spiritual stage and state of human existence. Because in the consciousness of the eternal source, there is no decay. Because there cannot be. Or the thing that we're talking about would stop being. And that makes it, therefore, a deception. And our transformation then takes place through these tiny steps. In order to become a butterfly, the caterpillar has to be willing as well as glad to give up the old sense of itself as a worm. We, metaphorically, are human caterpillars, advancing step by step into an eventual butterfly state of consciousness. And that's a state of consciousness that feels far off in the human world we're in now. But it's there. It exists in the infinite realm of possibilities. Now, in more precise terms, one more point really stands out to me, which continues to be missed across the board. And that's the point of exactly what matter is. The isness of matter, has even been defined by respected quantum physicists as essentially non-existent, at least in terms of matter possessing a state of being which exists independently of our being conscious of it. And that's what quantum physics is all about, or quantum philosophy at least. The late Hans-Peter Dürr, who was originally a personal student under the direction of Werner Heisenberg, and who directed the Max Planck Institute for several decades, points out repeatedly in his lectures and written works that experimental evidence points strongly to the fact that there is nothing to matter. And that when you get down to the smallest particles, you find that there's no difference between particles of matter and the energy in the matrix. Energy which is identifiable by its waveform. Professor Dürr literally said, there is no matter as such. And at the same time, he also admitted that to human consciousness, matter is something, and that it takes on a solid, substantial form via the action of being observed and perceived in human consciousness. And Professor Dürr continues by pointing out that form does not stand alone. It requires consciousness for wave information in the matrix to collapse and take form in our perception as, and this happens mentally, as manifest matter. In my own words, I would say that scientific evidence indicates that the solid form which matter appears to take on in human perception is only some kind of mentally produced cloak which, in the human mind, gives to ideas a sort of costume to wear, with which they can be recognized and be vaguely seen through the material senses. But the science of quantum physics has already concluded that there is nothing to matter. It concludes even that there is nothing really substantial to an electron, that the electron itself is not a small chunk of self-existent matter. It is, rather, a construct of pure energy, perceived and made manifest as something by consciousness. So we need to take this recognition seriously and be careful not to continue to be hindered by our own apparent human state of being. And this is my mantra. The recognition that matter is merely a construct of pure energy made seemingly manifest through the action of consciousness. This reveals the still transcendental necessity to admit that the objective of healing is not to manifest more healthy matter. That's just a side effect of thinking rightly. The real final objective of healing is to center and refocus thought on the spiritually substantial and on the eternal, on eternal harmonious isness. While it's true that the mental action of what some call quantum healing results in what the human mind calls healthier matter, that's only a human thought byproduct of the action of the spiritualization of thought. Creating healthier matter is not at all what the spiritual experience is about, because man is a spiritual being and not a material construct, as the human sense of existence has insisted and taught us for millennia. The spiritual existence is all about transcending matter, not about improving the presentation of matter itself. There obviously is a direct link between improved thought and improved material conditions. Which one of them is the cause and which one is the effect? Isn't thought the cause and matter the mentally manifest effect? Isn't thought the very substance of the body? Without thought, could the body be manifest as we know it? According to the revelations of quantum physics, and I think common spiritual sense, the answer is a resounding no. If we've decided to take the position that the quality of matter is nothing more than an indicator of the quality of thought operating in the human mind, then it should be clear that the creation of healthier matter is not at all the right goal to focus on in mental healing work. The substance of the body, its permanent isness, is not in its humanly material presentation of body. Its isness is in the perfect and eternal idea of body. And here with this point we get back into the transcendental. So I've gone on for a long time, and I have to admit that I start out every one of these videos with a concept that feels intuitively clear, but then I always run into difficulties in transforming these intuitions into logically understandable terminology, which means it gets very wordy. So I'm really happy if you made it through to this point. Please do feel more than free to comment and tell me if you made it through to the end. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and I'll talk to you soon, and see you soon in the next video.